All right, so we've dealt with the political aspect of the budget. Let's talk about hard economics of the budget. Does the numbers of the budget, the economics and the priorities of the Modi government come through in the budget that was presented yesterday by Nirmala Sitharaman? The face-off continues over the union budget between the centre and the opposition. The Congress has slammed the budget, calling it a copy-paste job from its own party Lok Sabha election manifesto, saying it does not address root causes of problems like unemployment, income inequality, price rise and the agrarian distress. The opposition even protested against the government over the allocations, a large chunk of it being cornered by two states for obvious political reasons, Andhra Pradesh and Bihar, calling this discriminatory towards other states. In fact, 4 opposition chief ministers will skip the upcoming NITI Aayog meeting on the 27th of July. This is in protest. The opposition termed the union budget a kursi bachao budget driven by political compulsions and claimed that opposition-ruled states have got a raw deal. But to try and get to the nub of this debate, whether this budget was good on detail, whether it stuck to the fiscal glide path, whether it may have been shorn of a grand vision, but it was a nuts and bolts budget, or whether, as the opposition says, it was completely bereft of any grand ideas, we try and decode the budget via the economic lens from both sides of the economic aisle, as it were. I want to first go across to Dr. Montek Ahluwalia, former Deputy Chief of the Planning Commission. Thank you very much, Dr. Ahluwalia, for speaking with us. First things first, what is your impression of the budget? What, according to you, were the big takeaways? While on the one hand, people have said there are no big-ticket reform ideas in the budget, but it's good in the nuts and bolts. It's ticked off all the boxes, whether it is the concern around jobs, whether it is getting more women into the workforce, and most importantly, it has stuck to all the fiscal targets without spending too much. So a sort of nuts and bolts kind of budget, maybe without vision, as it were.
Well, thank you for having me on your program. You know, I think we need to put our expectations about the budget or any budget in some perspective. I mean, there's a tendency when a budget is presented, and quite legitimately, the people want to look at it to see whether it solves all the many problems facing the economy. But realistically, I think you need to have a structured approach. The most important thing about a budget is, does it ensure macroeconomic stability? I mean, that's what everybody looks at first. And I think that from that perspective, the finance minister has done a good job. She's actually slightly improved the fiscal deficit compared to the interim budget earlier. But more importantly, she's stuck to her earlier promise that it's going to be 4.9% this year, and it's going to go down to 4.5%. I would have been happier if she had mentioned a target for the year beyond that. You know, traditionally, in the old days, the fiscal deficit, the macroeconomic framework document, would mention the fiscal deficit target for the next 2 years. Now, what the finance minister has said is that it's going to be 4.5, and that thereafter, she thinks it will keep going down a little bit so that the debt to GDP ratio falls. Now, that's actually quite a weak test because, you know, if the economy grows at, say, 6 or 7%, then you could have a gentle fall in the debt to GDP ratio, even though the fiscal deficit still remains a little high.
Okay.
So I would have been happier if she had said it's going to be 4.5% next year, and we're going to bring it down to 4% the year after. But it's clear that if you look at it, to the extent to which fiscal imbalances are a problem, I think most people looking at the budget will say this sends the right signals.
I do want to ask you about one particular sort of pain point. There are a couple, but the first one from a very viewer/middle class point of view has been on this whole business of taking away indexation on real estate for long-term capital gains on real estate. Now, the government's argument, and we spoke yesterday to the Revenue Secretary and the people who made the budget, and their argument is, A, the rate has been significantly brought down from 20% to 12.5%, so that should compensate for the taking away of the indexation. And two, they want to bring some kind of uniformity for all long-term capital gains tax across all asset classes, whether it is gold or real estate or whatever other asset class. Does that justification, does that defense hold? Because, like I said, on our Twitter feeds, on our social media, even just people who are calling in, our viewers are complaining about this the most, the fact that indexation has been taken away from real estate sales.
But generally, any withdrawal of an existing incentive does lead to some negative commentary. I'm not surprised at that. Frankly, I personally feel that it would have been much better if the finance minister, she has said that we are going to do a comprehensive relook at the Income Tax Act. That is actually necessary. The present act is a agglomeration of amendments. That about 6,000 amendments have been made since the act was last passed in 1961. It would have been much better if we had put out the whole reform so that people could look at what the totality of it is. Now, she said she's going to do that, and I think that it's very important how it's done. I am not very fond of the idea that you just do a lot of internal reviews and then make the change. I think maybe you should take a leaf out of the 1991 budget when, instead of making changes, what the finance minister then, Dr. Manmohan Singh, did was he appointed a very high-level committee, which included Radha Chelaya as its head, to look at the whole tax structure. And they prepared a report. That report was made public. So it gave an opportunity to discuss it. And I think if we are going to see a review, a reform of the income tax, I think it would be nice to take a look at the totality. I'm glad that they're talking of doing it. I just hope that it's not just an internal mechanism. I mean, I have the same comment on another quite important announcement that she made, not an actual announcement, but what she said was on customs duties, we are going to review the customs duties in the course of the next 6 months. Now, there's been a lot of discussion in many places that our duties are far too high. We are entering into FTAs. We should align our duties with the duties, external duties of the FTA areas. And I think here again, it would be a good idea not just to do an internal review, but to have a top-class expert group submit a report. You don't have to follow what they say, but if you make that report public, then people are able, before the next budget, to actually have a proper discussion. Otherwise, everybody is waiting for something, and suddenly it's announced. Immediately it gets into the political arena. It's not an environment in which you can have a very sensible view on these things.
I do want to ask you, Dr. Ahluwalia, about taxation, because again, that's the thing that concerns most people who are watching this broadcast, is over the last few years, there is a definitive thrust from the government to move towards what they call the new tax regime, which is essentially what you save, how much you save is your problem, the taxpayer's problem, not so much the government's concern. And the government wants to do away with all of this, PF investment and investment in housing loans and so on and so forth, because that's not the job of the government. The job of how much an individual saves or invests is that individual's concern. Directionally, if at some point, and she was asked a question about this in the press conference, if there is a sunset to the old tax regime and the new tax regime is the only one that's in operation, directionally, is that something that you agree with?
Oh, I certainly do. I mean, the whole point of introducing a new tax regime is they're taking care of some of the pre-existing problems. People have had some time to adjust. Here again, if you subject this thing to a group of experts who could tell you what are the dangers of not doing it, you would have a more prepared public. But I think the idea of having two tax regimes and people choose whichever tax regime they want doesn't actually make much sense. So we should be moving to a new tax regime. But what I feel is that we should devise that regime based on the recommendation of some experts, which are made public. So you can have full discussion before the next budget. And I would say the same for customs duties.
I want to get one final question. I guess what the big thrust, a large part of her speech was dedicated to jobs, particularly jobs for young people who are entering the workforce. So whether it is payment of 3 months' salary in 3 different tranches, whether it is incentivizing corporates to hire interns. I think 1 crore interns is what she said with the top 500 firms, 5,000 rupees as some kind of a stipend to these interns. Forget about the politics of it. People are saying that this is in response to the mandate and the need for young people to be employed and employed well enough. But that's a separate matter. I want to ask you if these measures will work. Will this help formalize more and more people into the formal sectors of employment?
Well, I think, look, the overall employment problem is a very large one. And I don't think any individual actions will make a huge difference. I mean, after all, the biggest impact on employment is really going to be, will we maintain a high enough rate of growth? I mean, if the growth rate slips and you have these schemes, it's not going to make any difference. So you need that high growth. I think you also need a structure of incentives where middle scale enterprises, not very capital intensive, also have an incentive to expand. Some of what's being done, for example, on access to credit for middle scale enterprises is a good thing. But remember, we've had these things before. You know, in all of this, the devil is in the detail. So unless all this is spelt out, it's very difficult to judge exactly what would happen. But more broadly, I do think that we are behind the curve on the apprenticeship system compared to Europe, compared to Singapore, compared to South Korea. And I think the idea of encouraging our larger corporate sector to take on more apprentices is a good one. Now, how it works will depend on the detail. We don't have all that. I mean, for example, it's not clear at the moment whether this is purely voluntary or it's compulsory or what. So some of this will have to be sorted out. But, you know, I think there are the skilling, the deficiency of skilling cannot only be taken care of by apprenticeship schemes. I mean, we need to do a major job in upgrading our capacity to skill our workforce. And we've known this for the last 15 years. I mean, there have been innumerable schemes which are designed to make the skill programs more relevant, even to bring the private sector in. But for some reason, they don't seem to be working. So I think what we'd like to see is a critical evaluation. Why have they not worked? And what are we doing now that will be different?
All right, Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, thank you very much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to hear your perspective on the budget that's just been presented. Thank you. All right, now to try and get the view from the other side, I'm now joined by Professor Rajiv Kumar. He's former Vice Chairman of the NITI Aayog. Thank you very much, sir. Just before you joined, we had a friend of yours from across the aisle, Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, join us, and he gave us his perspective on the budget. I want to start off with what many, certainly our viewers on social media, on our phone lines, the big pain point that they're talking about is this removal of indexation on long-term capital gains tax for real estate. How would you explain to them the rationale for taking away the indexation on real estate?
Hi, Zaka. Great to be here. And honestly, to begin with, I was also taken aback with the removal of the indexation. And I said, what's going on here? And you know, what I found out is that if you, with the decline in the long-term capital gains from 20% to 12.5% on real property, on real estate, as long as you sell a property within, let's say, a reasonable period of time, 3, 4, 5 years, then you stand to actually gain, by what's happened, because your inflation, is whatever is 20% or something like that, and your property goes up by a similar amount, and you pay a much lower tax than 20% and 12.5%. It's when the long term kicks in, when you're selling a property after 20 years, 25 years, etc. That is when it hurts. because that is when your inflation would have gone up much more. And in fact, there is a situation, many people have worked it out, that if you buy a property for 1 crore 20 years ago and sell it at 3 or 4 crores, and if you allow for indexation, you actually end up saying that your property value today is lower than what it was when you bought it. Now, so it's a long-term situation, about 15, 20 years, where removal of indexation, net of the decline in the reduction in the tax rate will matter. Now, that will affect people mostly who are inheriting property, honestly, I mean, most of the time. Because most of us, when we, if you, there's the two things about property. One, that you invest in it to, for example, live in it, or to start a business in it, etc. Now, that's not an investment in an asset class. An investment in asset class is when you are investing in real estate to try and make some capital gains in a period of time and then sell it. I mean, that's your speculative, if you like, or investment class. Now, in that, as I said, most people, for example, don't hold other asset classes also for a very long term, equities or gold, etc., etc. So net, for the short-term duration of real property holding, the reduction in the long-term capital gains tax combined with the removal of the indexation would leave that property holder still better off
So I
than
have
what
two clarifications to seek on that. One is, like you said, in India, and you're well aware of this, people are not buying houses just as an asset class. I mean, there's sentiment attached to it and so on and so forth. And people don't, buy and sell a house in 5 years or 7 years. They keep a house for like 20 years. So what happens to those people who in their 20s or 30s bought a house and either after 20 years want to upgrade to a bigger house or want to leave from their workplaces, go back to their hometowns and therefore want to sell the house? Because what this does is the longer you hold that property, the more you're ending up paying in tax because indexation has been taken off. That's number one. Number two, wouldn't this also lead to further underreporting of the actual value of these transactions, i.e., that let's say 70% value is shown and the remaining 30% is, as they say very famously in this part of the world, taken in black?
On both points, you are correct, Zaka. I agree with you that, I mean, and that's the second one is actually probably more important, that already the real estate market, the property market is seen as an instrument of, if you like, money laundering or, dealing in cash, etc., etc. And that might well be encouraged by this action, because you want to, lower your selling price, by registered selling price, by as much as you can. So that will happen. But on the other hand, while I agree with you, it's a very specific case of people, of migrants moving into a town, then living there for 20 years and then moving back, etc. Now, as I said earlier, 99% of those people will actually leave the house to their inheritors, and the inheritors will have to pay a higher tax, undoubtedly. And now, I don't mind that, because I think in most countries, inheritance, there is inheritance tax, there is a state duty, there is something like that. We don't have that. And it's all right that we don't have that. But in which case, I mean, these are like windfall gains. I mean, these are gains that you haven't earned. You just inherited them. And if you're paying a little slightly higher tax on that after 20 years, I don't think that matters so much.
I want to talk about clearly one of the big thrust areas of the budget was about jobs, particularly jobs for young people who are entering the workforce. And again, in the chat that I had with Dr. Ahluwalia, he said two things. One, it's a good thing, but we're not sure about, A, is it voluntary or mandatory for these top 500 companies to employ these interns? Two, why would they employ or hire at the lower end if there is no requirement? What is the incentive for them to do so? And he says, if you were to look at, let's say, the European model of apprenticeship or the American model of apprenticeship, we are not quite there. We don't quite have that same system.
Yeah, we want to get there. We're not quite there, but that's and the intention of the budget is to try and nudge the companies towards that, which is to have a higher intake of apprentices or interns on their roll, and offering actually net fiscal incentive for that. Now, it is surely voluntary. It cannot be mandatory, because if it is mandatory, then you would get into a lot of trouble, because then you'll get all sorts of coercion and this and that and the other. And It's not clear in the budget. That's very, that's true. But it should be clarified that it is voluntary. And then also, it may not be restricted to the top 500. I said yesterday on a channel that that's a good beginning, but you can expand it to the next 500 or whatever you like. And and if it works, then I think it's one of the best ways to close the gap between the skills that are demanded and the skills which are supplied, by the current skill development programs or the ITIs, etc., etc. And I have this wonderful example from Pune, the Maharashtra Open University run by Vivek Sawant, where every student is also an apprentice, and they get 120% placement. And every student also, is apprenticing in the factories over the week, and over the weekend, they have their courses. I think it's a great step in that direction, and it is this what is required in a much even more larger scale, if you like, because apprenticeship, especially the German model, is the way to go for our, for us to utilize our young talent and the youth and the pool that we've got, rather than leave them to be unemployable by the skill training that they get otherwise.
One final question, this is quasi-political, quasi-economic. I mean, there's a lot of hangama today in Parliament by the opposition, who are saying basically that, look, a bulk or the lion's share of yesterday's budget announcements have been cornered by two states, Bihar and Andhra Pradesh, and not for economic reasons, but for purely political reasons, because the Modi government depends on these two coalition partners from Bihar and Andhra Pradesh. Is that a valid criticism?
Well, not in terms of the budget numbers. It might be valid in the number in the terms of number of words used for Bihar and Andhra as a total number of words in the budget speech. And that might be well true. But if you look at the actual numbers of expenditures, the share of total expenditure of 48.1 lakh crores, going to Bihar and Andhra is in several decimal places. I mean, it's infinitesimal. It's not very much. I mean, it's a few. It's 10,000 crores there, 15,000 crores there. And the other important thing that we should remember is that a large part of it, the finance minister clarified, will come from additional resources to be mobilized from multilateral development banks, for which the central government only offers a sovereign guarantee. And that's the only cost that it meets. And in fact, these will be loans on very soft terms, undoubtedly. But these are additional to what the budget is presenting. And the budget allocation for them is actually quite small if you look at it. So, yes, in terms of the attention given in the speech, it is inordinate, and it's clearly, it's 2 out of the 28, which looks odd. But in terms of actual expenditure in the budget, the argument doesn't hold.
All right, Professor Rajiv Kumar, it's always a pleasure speaking with you, sir. Thank you so much for joining us with your thoughts and perspective. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so there you heard it from two sides of the economic divide, as it were. First from Dr. Ahluwalia, and then subsequently from Professor Rajiv Kumar, as to what they think of Nirmala Sitharaman's budget 24-25. We leave the political verdict to the people and, of course, to the proceedings in Parliament, where the discussion on the finance bill is continuing. It will go on till the early part of next week. If you'd been tuned in to Brass Tacks from me, Zakir Jacob, and the rest of the team, we were coming to you live from the CNN News 18 Federal Bank Primetime Studio. Thank you very much for your time. Good night.